The raging waters of the Mississippi River during the catastrophic flood of 1870 showed no mercy to anyone in their path. But what frontier Dr. Jonathan Webb pulled from the churning rapids near St. Louis would set in motion a chain of events that defied all understanding of fate and destiny. A Native American infant, barely clinging to life on a piece of shattered driftwood, represented an impossible choice between personal safety and moral duty during nature's deadliest onslaught. What Jonathan risked during those desperate moments, plunging into waters that had already claimed hundreds of lives to save a child he'd never met, would return to his doorstep 2 decades later in the most unexpected form imaginable. Chapter 1. The Deluge and the Doctor. The Mississippi River during the spring of 1874 transformed from a vital commercial waterway into a monstrous force of destruction that consumed everything in its path with terrifying efficiency. Dr. Jonathan Webb had witnessed considerable suffering during his 12 years practicing frontier medicine, but nothing had prepared him for the apocalyptic devastation unleashed when weeks of relentless rainfall sent the great river surging over its banks with catastrophic fury. The floodwaters rose with such alarming speed that entire communities vanished beneath the churning brown torrent, their homes and possessions swept away as if they had never existed. Jonathan established a makeshift medical station on high ground near St. Louis, working without rest as desperate survivors arrived hourly with injuries ranging from broken limbs to near drowning. At 36 years old, he possessed the steady hands and calm demeanor essential for frontier medical work, qualities that served him well as he treated victims whose traumatic experiences had left them in shock beyond coherent speech. His medical supplies dwindled rapidly as the scope of the disaster became increasingly apparent, with hundreds confirmed dead and thousands more displaced from their homes along the swollen river. The afternoon of May 15th brought conditions that tested even Jonathan's considerable resolve as he worked through pouring rain to stabilize patients in tents that provided minimal shelter from the elements. The river continued rising despite prayers from desperate survivors who watched helplessly as the waters claimed additional territory with each passing hour. Debris floated past in an endless procession, shattered furniture, livestock carcasses, and the heartbreaking remnants of lives destroyed by nature's merciless power. Jonathan was suturing a deep laceration on a farmer's arm when shouting erupted from survivors gathered near the water's edge. Through the driving rain, he spotted what had captured their attention, a small bundle floating among the debris, moving with the current's relentless pull toward certain destruction in the rapids downstream. Most observers assumed they were witnessing another tragic casualty, but something about the object's movement suggested possibilities that demanded immediate investigation. Without conscious thought, Jonathan abandoned his medical work and sprinted toward the riverbank, his trained eye recognizing what others had missed. The bundle moved independently of the current's flow, suggesting something alive struggled within the fabric that appeared ready to sink beneath the surface at any moment. The distance between the shore and the floating object expanded rapidly as the powerful current carried it toward the deadly rapids that had already claimed countless victims. Jonathan's decision required less than 3 seconds of consideration before he plunged into the raging floodwaters, ignoring the desperate warnings shouted by survivors who understood the suicidal nature of his attempt. The current seized him immediately with crushing force, pulling him under the murky surface as he fought desperately to maintain his bearings in the chaotic underwater environment. His medical training had included limited swimming instruction, but nothing had prepared him for the raw power of floodwaters moving with such devastating momentum. He surfaced gasping for air, his arms pumping frantically as he angled toward the floating bundle that now appeared impossibly distant through the sheets of rain hammering the river surface. Every muscle screamed in protest as he fought the current's relentless pull, making agonizingly slow progress despite maximum effort. Twice more, the waters dragged him under, filling his lungs with the river's muddy taste as panic threatened to overwhelm his determination. His hand finally closed around waterlogged fabric just as consciousness began fading from oxygen deprivation. revealing what he had risked everything to reach. An infant, perhaps 6 months old, lay wrapped in traditional Native American cloth of exceptional quality. The child's tiny face showed the dusky pallor of near drowning, his small chest motionless as Jonathan clutched him desperately while struggling to reach the distant shore. The return journey stretched into an eternity of suffering as Jonathan's strength failed rapidly under the combined strain of swimming and maintaining his grip on the unconscious infant. Willing hands finally pulled both doctor and child from the water's deadly embrace, dragging them onto muddy ground as Jonathan's vision darkened around the edges from complete physical exhaustion. His last conscious act before collapsing involved positioning the infant for the emergency procedures that represented the child's only chance for survival. Chapter 2. The Search and the Secret. The infant's first gasping breath came after 3 agonizing minutes of Jonathan's desperate resuscitation efforts, his small chest finally rising with a reflexive cough that expelled river water from tiny lungs. The gathered survivors released collective sighs of relief as the child's cry pierced the air, that unmistakable sound of life reasserting itself against overwhelming odds. Jonathan cradled the baby carefully while examining him for injuries, his trained hands checking for broken bones or internal damage that might have resulted from the violent journey through floodwaters filled with deadly debris. The child appeared remarkably unharmed despite his traumatic ordeal, his sturdy constitution evident in the strength of his cries and the vigor with which he protested the cold rain. Jonathan wrapped him in dry blankets, scavenged from the medical supplies, noting details that spoke volumes about the infant's origins and family status. The cloth that had protected him during his desperate float carried intricate beadwork of exceptional quality, patterns that indicated considerable wealth and social prominence within tribal society. Most telling were the distinctive markings on a small leather pouch attached to the wrappings, symbols that Jonathan recognized as Lakota in origin despite his limited knowledge of Plains tribal customs. Jonathan's attempts to locate the child's family began immediately, though the chaos of the flood's aftermath made systematic searching nearly impossible. Thousands of displaced people wandered through the devastated landscape, seeking lost relatives, their desperate calls echoing across terrain transformed into an apocalyptic wasteland by the river's fury. Native American families had suffered disproportionately during the catastrophe, their riverside settlements completely obliterated by waters that showed no mercy to anyone, regardless of race or status. Local authorities demonstrated shocking indifference when Jonathan reported his rescue of the native infant. Their racist attitudes were typical of frontier society during the 1870s. The sheriff suggested simply leaving the child at the overcrowded orphanage that had become a dumping ground for flood victims nobody wanted to claim. Federal Indian agents showed equally little interest in helping locate survivors from displaced tribal communities, their bureaucratic processes designed to relocate native peoples rather than reunite separated families. Jonathan refused every suggestion to abandon the infant to institutional care, recognizing that such facilities offered minimal chances for survival even under normal circumstances. The chaos following the flood had stretched all charitable organizations beyond their capacity, transforming orphanages into warehouses where children receive basic sustenance but little else. He made the decision to personally care for the child while continuing his search, bringing the infant to his medical station, where nursing mothers among the survivors provided the nourishment necessary for keeping him alive. The baby thrived under Jonathan's attentive care, his robust health suggesting strong genetics and excellent prenatal nutrition. Jonathan named him River temporarily, acknowledging the waters that had nearly claimed his young life while preserving his anonymity until the proper family could be located. The infant's temperament revealed itself through weeks of observation. He possessed unusual alertness for his age, tracking movement with intelligent eyes that suggested the awareness of someone destined for significant achievements. Jonathan's breakthrough came 5 weeks after the rescue, when a Lakota elder named Walking Bear arrived at the medical station seeking information about missing tribal members. The old man's weathered face transformed with recognition upon seeing the distinctive beadwork on the infant's wrappings, his trembling hands reaching out to touch the fabric he identified immediately. Walking Bear explained through broken English that the child came from the family of Red Thunder, a prominent war chief whose entire band had been camping along the river when the flood struck without warning during the night. The elder's news carried devastating weight. Red Thunder's entire family was believed lost in the catastrophe, with no survivors located despite weeks of searching by tribal members. The baby represented the sole survivor from a bloodline that carried considerable importance within Lakota society. His survival was viewed as spiritually significant by those who understood tribal prophecies. Walking Bear revealed that the child's birth had been accompanied by visions predicting a great destiny, dreams that foretold his future role as a leader who would bridge impossible divides. Jonathan faced an agonizing decision as Walking Bear prepared to take the infant to distant relatives who would raise him according to tribal customs, far from frontier settlements. Saying goodbye to the child he had risked everything to save proved more difficult than anticipated, creating bonds that transcended the brief weeks of their acquaintance. Chapter 3: 20 Years of Silence. The decades following Jonathan Webb's rescue of the Lakota infant passed with the relentless momentum that characterized life on the American frontier during its final transformative years. Jonathan's medical practice flourished in the growing town of Cedar Rapids, his reputation as a skilled physician attracting patients from throughout the surrounding territories. At 56 years old, he had witnessed the frontier's evolution from wild territory into established civilization, though the memories of that desperate rescue during the 1874 flood remained vivid despite the passage of 20 years. Jonathan rarely spoke of the infant he had pulled from the Mississippi's deadly current, recognizing that most settlers possessed little interest in stories about saving native lives during an era when racial tensions dominated frontier politics. The child's fate remained unknown despite Jonathan's periodic inquiries through trading posts and Indian agencies. His questions consistently met with bureaucratic indifference or incomplete information that led nowhere productive. Walking Bear had taken the infant westward toward Lakota territories, disappearing into the vast plains where tribal movements followed patterns incomprehensible to government officials tasked with tracking native populations. The 1890s brought escalating conflicts between plains tribes and the encroaching wave of settlement that consumed traditional hunting grounds with devastating efficiency. Jonathan treated casualties from both sides of these confrontations, his medical ethics refusing to discriminate based on race despite pressure from townspeople who viewed such impartiality as borderline treasonous. The violence that periodically erupted throughout the territories created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion where cooperation between cultures became increasingly rare and dangerous. Rumors began filtering through Cedar Rapids during the spring of 1894 about a legendary warrior rising to prominence among the unified Plains tribes. Trading Post gossip spoke of a young Lakota leader whose tactical brilliance had united fractious bands into a formidable coalition capable of challenging federal authority throughout the northern territories. The warrior's name carried weight that made seasoned frontiersmen nervous. Standing Bear, they called him, though some whispered his war name with superstitious dread that transcended rational fear. The stories described Standing Bear as possessing unusual characteristics for a traditional war leader. He spoke multiple languages fluently, understood settler tactics with uncanny precision, and demonstrated strategic thinking that suggested education beyond typical tribal knowledge. Most intriguing were accounts of his distinctive leadership style, which emphasized the protection of his people through strength rather than the revenge-driven raids that characterized other resistance movements. His growing influence threatened to reshape the balance of power throughout territories where government control remained tenuous at best. Jonathan dismissed any connection between these rumors and the infant he had rescued 2 decades earlier, recognizing that thousands of native children had survived the tumultuous years since the Great Flood. The odds of that specific child rising to such prominence seemed impossibly remote, wishful thinking that served no practical purpose beyond satisfying curiosity about roads not taken. He focused instead on his medical practice and the tangible good he could accomplish by treating patients who needed his skills. Cedar Rapids prospered despite the growing tensions that plagued surrounding territories. Its strategic location and strong defenses discouraged the raids that devastated less prepared settlements. Jonathan's position as the town's most respected physician provided comfortable security as he entered what should have been the peaceful twilight of his frontier career. Nothing in his experience suggested that the quiet routine of his established life would soon be shattered by the return of someone whose existence he had preserved during 3 desperate minutes beside the flooding Mississippi River. Chapter 4. The Warlord Returns. The autumn morning of October 1894 began with unusual stillness that settled over Cedar Rapids like a suffocating blanket, the kind of unnatural quiet that preceded storms or other catastrophic events. Jonathan Webb was preparing his medical office for the day's appointments when urgent knocking shattered the peaceful routine, followed by the mayor's panicked voice demanding immediate entry. The terror in the official's tone triggered alarm bells honed by decades of frontier emergencies, prompting Jonathan to abandon his preparations and rush to the door. Mayor Henderson's face had gone pale beneath his customary ruddiness, his hands trembling as he struggled to form coherent sentences. The words finally spilled out in a breathless rush. A massive force of native warriors had appeared on the ridge overlooking Cedar Rapids at dawn, their numbers exceeding anything witnessed in the territories for decades. Hundreds of mounted fighters representing multiple Plains tribes sat motionless in perfect military formation, their presence suggesting coordinated planning that transcended typical raiding parties. Most terrifying was their leader, a young war chief whose reputation had spread throughout the frontier like wildfire during recent months. Standing Bear had come to Cedar Rapids with an army at his back, and nobody understood why this particular town had attracted the attention of the most feared native leader in the Northern Territories. The assembled warriors made no hostile moves, simply waiting with disciplined patience that suggested confidence born from overwhelming tactical advantage. Their peaceful posture provided little comfort to townspeople who understood that such a force could overwhelm Cedar Rapids' modest defenses within minutes if violence erupted. Jonathan joined the nervous crowd gathering near the town's entrance, his medical training forcing calm assessment despite the fear gripping everyone around him. The warrior formation indeed presented an impressive display of coordinated strength, their horses perfectly aligned in rows that demonstrated exceptional military discipline. At their center sat a commanding figure whose bearing radiated the natural authority of someone born to lead others through impossible circumstances. Standing Bear dismounted with fluid grace and began walking toward the town alone, his warriors remaining motionless as their leader approached the gathered settlers with deliberate steps that carried no hint of aggression. Jonathan found himself pushed forward by the mayor and town council, designated as negotiator due to his reputation for fairness in treating native patients during past conflicts. As the distance between them closed, Jonathan studied the young war chief's face for clues about his intentions. Recognition struck Jonathan like a physical blow as he finally saw Standing Bear's features clearly in the morning light. The high cheekbones, the distinctive shape of the eyes, and most tellingly, a small birthmark beneath the left ear. These details matched perfectly with memories burned into Jonathan's consciousness during those desperate weeks caring for an orphaned infant 20 years earlier. The impossibility of the situation warred with undeniable evidence standing before him in the form of a powerful warrior whose very existence defied reasonable probability. Standing Bear's expression transformed as he studied Jonathan's face with equal intensity, his own memories clearly providing confirmation of identity despite 2 decades of separation. When the war chief finally spoke, his perfect English carried emotion that transcended the formal diplomatic language expected during such tense encounters. He addressed Jonathan by name, acknowledging the man who had risked everything to pull a drowning infant from the Mississippi's deadly flood, the physician who had refused to abandon a native child despite societal pressure and personal inconvenience. The reunion that followed dissolved the tension gripping Cedar Rapids, as Standing Bear publicly declared Jonathan Webb under permanent tribal protection, extending that safety to encompass the entire town in recognition of the debt owed to the man who had preserved his life. The young war chief explained his rise to leadership, describing how Walking Bear had raised him with stories of the white doctor's selfless courage, tales that shaped his understanding of honor and duty across cultural boundaries. Standing Bear's gift transformed Cedar Rapids into a sacred neutral ground where peace prevailed while surrounding territories burned with conflict, proving that one act of desperate courage could echo across 20 years to save not just a single life, but an entire community. If this incredible story of sacrifice and unexpected destiny moved you, smash that like button and subscribe for more astonishing true tales where split-second decisions changed history forever. What would you risk to save a stranger's life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.